And now on to a story that we continue to cover, U.S. sanctions in Iran. Late last week, the U.S. Senate voted to increase sanctions, imposing new penalties on any foreign businesses and banks that have ties to Iran's ports, shipping, shipbuilding, or energy. This would bring policy one step closer to a total trade embargo on Iran. Now, these sanctions were added by the Senate to the annual defense authorization bill, which still needs to be voted on by the House of Representatives and signed into law by the president. To talk more about these sanctions and also U.S. policy in Iran, I'm joined now by Jamal Abdi, Policy Director for the National Iranian American Council. And I know, Jamal, these sanctions, of course, are in response to, the threat of nuclear weapon in Iran. But it seems like the White House, isn't on board with the sanctions voted on by the Senate. Talk a little bit about this clash in ideals here.
Well, I wouldn't call it a clash. It was a very quiet confrontation, if anything. This was a sanctions package that was proposed initially as a total embargo, as sort of the last step in this sanctions dance that we've seen over the past couple years.
The last step before the next step.
Full exhaustion of the sanctions and what's left but potentially a naval blockade to enforce a total embargo. That's, of course, an act of war. There's also talk of, this spring or summer being Israel's, last point before they actually go in and strike.
The so-called red line.
The so-called red line. We've heard the red line articulated many times in the past, but, there's indications that this is the most serious of the red lines that have been drawn. But the point is that the supporters of the sanctions have articulated this as being sort of a race to the end with Iran, that we need to escalate our sanctions towards a full embargo before they can race to become quote-unquote nuclear capable, which is a very unclear term. And so what happened was the supporters of this did not get everything that they wanted. They didn't get the total embargo, but they still did manage to ratchet up the sanctions. This is the third time in just the past calendar year that they've managed to do this. And the White House is understandably frustrated by this because we are now in a period where we are supposedly going to enter negotiations and where, the U.S. election cycle has ended. We have a brief period of time before March when the Iranian election cycle begins and they're unable to do anything diplomatically. And so we have this brief window where we need to have serious talks. And there's a sense that Congress is interfering and sort of undermining the president's flexibility by passing yet another round of sanctions that are potentially going to, upset some of the United States' allies in this process.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about, because this is not a direct action on Iran. This is a direct action on anyone who does business with Iran. So obviously, in the long run, who does that hurt the most? It hurts Iran. But what about some of these other countries who would be penalized for doing business with Iran? I mean, what are you hearing is their reaction?
Yeah, I think there's concern about these measures, that every time we've seen this in the past, there's been this concern. For instance, these sanctions are really going to hit potentially Turkey pretty hard because Turkey depends on Iran for its gas. Right now, they've worked out some arrangements where they're essentially bartering through the use of gold in order for Iran to continue to sell gas to Turkey. If this gets cut off, it's unclear what Turkey can do. And so I think my sense is that what the administration would like is for more waivers in these sanctions to give them, at the very least, some flexibility with our allies to say, we are actually partners in this. We're not, we're not going into a, economic war with you.
Well, an example right now of a waiver, I think, is, China obviously does business with Iran, and the U.S. has not, imposed major penalties on China for that.
Right, exactly. And those were built in because the administration did sort of take on Congress last December with central bank sanctions and managed to win some very short-term temporary waivers that they can enforce sort of at their discretion. The real issue, the fundamental issue here, though, is that the administration doesn't have a waiver to use at the table with Iran, per se. There's a lack of clarity about what Iran would have to do in order to get the U.S. to be able to lift these sanctions or suspend them. And so there's a lack of confidence, I think, every time these sanctions get passed, that the sanctions are actually going to be used as leverage rather than just a sort of a step-by-step incremental approach towards a confrontation.
And Jamal, when we talk about sanctions, it's really interesting because this is sort of seen as a non-violent alternative to any sort of military violence, and it's sold to the American people as a way, to show that we're tough, but it doesn't actually, physically hurt anyone. But that's not really the whole story, is it?
It's definitely not the whole story. We're seeing now reports of there was a young Iranian kid who died because he couldn't get medicine for hemophilia treatment. And we're hearing about these increased shortages of medicine in Iran because the sanctions are cutting off those imports. So this is having real effects. Now, this is a problem that the drafters of these new sanctions took into account. They acknowledge that they exist, but instead of actually taking action to make sure that our sanctions aren't cutting off medical exports to Iran, instead they said, well, we're going to demand the president give us a report about who is diverting these medical goods from Iranians. Now, that's fantastic if that's what we need to get to the bottom of this, but at the end of the day, if that report actually comes through, if it names Iranian officials, great, let's make sure that's not happening. But we do know that the sanctions are going to be are a main culprit of this, and we're going to have to look in the mirror and say, okay, now what can we do to make sure that we're actually not the ones who are responsible for ordinary Iranians dying because of lack of access to basic medicine?
Yeah, absolutely, especially when it comes to young people there. Let's switch gears a little bit because these sanctions aren't the only sort of new policy. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal that talked about the increased use of surveillance drones by the U.S. over Iran. Talk about the impact that has.
Well, we heard a few weeks ago about a drone that was actually shot at by Iranian jets. This, was understandably an area for concern. We know that the U.S. apparently is escalating these drone flights, and the Iranians have complained to the U.S. that these flights are violating Iran's territory. The U.S. denies that. But we also know that, I think it was last year or several months ago, a spy drone was actually shot down inside of Iran. There have been reports of real cloak and dagger type stuff going on inside of Iran, where you've had street signs replaced by cameras and monitoring devices by the U.S. and its intelligence assets inside of Iran. So there seems to be a pretty thick blanket of surveillance over Iran. But the problem here is that, for one, it really doesn't do a whole lot to, bolster confidence or trust between the two countries. And two, there is a need for more oversight and surveillance, but it has to be done in a legal fashion. And there is a legal basis with which to do that, and that's the IAEA, the UN Nuclear Monitoring Agency. And what we should be doing, hopefully, if we can get these talks started, is to work on an end game that involves greater legal inspections by the IAEA that Iran accepts, that can give the U.S. and its partners assurance that Iran's not moving towards a nuclear weapon, and gives Iran its entitlement to a domestic enrichment program.
But wasn't this sort of the process before? Why isn't this something that could be working?
This is something that could be working if we're actually having these negotiations, and I think there's a lack of clarity about what is our end goal. Can we arrive at a point where inspections are robust enough that we can be assured that there isn't a problem here and we can actually put this issue to rest?
Yeah, certainly lots to consider and some interesting new developments here. Jamal Abdi, Policy Director for the National Iranian American Council. Thanks so much.
Thank you.